Cops mock veteran at diner until they see what's on his table. Undefined. The autumn morning settled over Maplewood like a familiar blanket, cool air carrying the scent of dying leaves through empty streets. In Murphy's diner, the ancient floorboards groaned their wooden song beneath shuffling feet, while steam rose from coffee cups like incense in a sacred ritual. The air hung thick with bacon grease and yesterday's conversations, wrapping the small space in the kind of comfort only found in places where stories live in every corner. Raymond Cooper occupied his usual table by the window, fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that had seen 1,000 mornings like this one. At 72, his body carried the weight of decades, shoulders slightly hunched beneath a jacket whose better days were distant memories, jeans soft with washing and wear. His weathered hands moved with deliberate precision as he lifted a black pen, pausing to consider the blank page of his notepad. Simple thoughts needed capturing. Grocery list items, a reminder about his doctor's appointment, fragments of memories that surfaced unbidden in quiet moments. The diner's bell announced new arrivals with its familiar brass voice. Officers Harris and Locke swept through the doorway, trailing an aura of metropolitan authority that seemed to push against Maplewood's gentle rhythms. Their uniforms bore the sharp creases of recent pressing, badges catching the fluorescent light like small mirrors reflecting their own importance. They paused at the threshold, eyes scanning the modest interior with the calculating gaze of hunters assessing territory. Harris nudged his partner, chin jerking toward Raymond's solitary figure. "What's that old guy doing here so early?" Scribbling in a notepad. The words slipped out in a stage whisper designed to carry. Locke's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Hard to say. They approached the counter where Nora, the diner's heart and soul for 30 years, offered her customary greeting. The officers ordered their coffee with the clipped efficiency of men accustomed to being obeyed, then carried their steaming mugs to a booth that provided a clear view of Raymond's table. They settled with practiced casualness, but their attention remained fixed on the older man like a searchlight that couldn't find its target. Raymond sensed their scrutiny the way a deer senses wolves, some primal awareness that prickled along his spine. He continued his quiet routine, occasionally lifting the pen to capture a fleeting thought, the scratch of graphite against paper barely audible above the diner's ambient hum. "Morning," Harris called out, his voice carrying none of the warmth typically associated with the greeting. "Looks like you're busy, old-timer." Raymond turned, offering the kind of polite nod that had served him well through decades, currency to be spent for admiration or advantage. "Army," he answered simply, meeting Harris's gaze without flinching. "A while back." The officers exchanged glances laden with meaning that Raymond couldn't decipher but recognized as hostile. Something about his quiet composure, his refusal to shrink beneath their attention, seemed to kindle their irritation like a match touched to kindling. "Army?" Locke repeated, letting out a short laugh that held no humor. "Sure doesn't look like you had a big pension." His eyes flicked meaningfully to Raymond's modest attire. "I get by," Raymond replied, his politeness unwavering despite the heat beginning to build behind his ribs. Harris leaned forward, the predator in him scenting weakness. "Sometimes we see folks pretending to be veterans, fishing for discounts, respect they haven't earned. Any chance you're one of those guys?" The diner's ambient chatter died as if someone had thrown a switch. Nearby patrons turned in their seats, conversation suspended as tension filled the air like electricity before a storm. Nora paused in her counterwiping, casting a nervous glance toward Raymond. She knew him as a gentle soul who left generous tips and never caused trouble, whose eyes sometimes held a sadness that spoke of burdens carried in silence. Raymond's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign that the accusation had found its mark. "I don't pretend anything," he said softly, each word measured and deliberate. "I served. That's all." "If you served, where's your proof?" Locke scoffed, gesturing dismissively. "We get a lot of phonies around these parts. Stolen valor's no joke." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Raymond reached for his wallet, with movements that betrayed none of the turmoil churning in his chest. He withdrew a small card, VA identification, its edges soft with age and handling, and slid it across the table toward the officers with the reverence one might show a religious artifact. Locke snatched it up, scrutinizing the card with theatrical suspicion, while Harris leaned over his shoulder. They exchanged another loaded glance, uncertainty flickering in their eyes for just a moment before Harris flicked the card back across the table. It landed with a soft slap that seemed to echo in the hushed space. "Looks fake," Harris muttered dismissively. Around them, the other diners watched with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity to carefully suppressed outrage. But this was Maplewood, population barely 3,000, where crossing the police, even new ones, could complicate a person's quiet life in ways that outlasted any momentary satisfaction from intervening. Raymond tucked the card away, his composure intact, but something wounded flickering in his eyes like a flame guttering in the wind. "I have no need to lie," he said quietly. Locke chuckled, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "Well, maybe you're one of those vets who got themselves discharged dishonorably. Could explain a lot." The words hit Raymond like a physical blow, stealing his breath for just an instant. He inhaled slowly, drawing on reserves of dignity that ran deeper than these men could fathom. Rather than dignify the accusation with a defense, he simply shook his head, but his silence only seemed to embolden them. Harris sneered, pointing at the notepad. "You know, wearing that jacket, pretending you served with honor, people like you make me sick. Writing a sob story, maybe? Scamming folks for donations? I'm just jotting things down for my day," Raymond replied, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. "No scams here." "Why don't you leave?" Locke crossed his arms, puffing up with borrowed authority. "This place doesn't need your type lurking around, making customers uncomfortable." Raymond straightened in his chair, finding steel in his spine that these officers couldn't see, but any battlefield veteran would recognize. "I'm not bothering anyone. I have the right to have coffee where I please." Harris rose from his seat, towering over the older man as silence fell across the diner like a heavy curtain. "You better watch your tone," he growled. "We can toss you out of here for being a nuisance." Raymond glanced around the diner at faces that couldn't quite meet his eyes, at people who knew this was wrong, but lacked the courage to act on that knowledge. Part of him wanted to walk away, to spare himself further humiliation. But something deeper. The part of him that had once worn a different uniform with honor rebelled against the idea of surrendering to their bullying. The tension crackled as Harris reached out, grabbing the front of Raymond's jacket. "Let's see if you're packing anything suspicious." Raymond's heart hammered against his ribs as rough hands patted him down, but he didn't resist. 60 years of living in the world had taught him when to fight and when to endure. "Nothing but old bones," Locke joked with casual cruelty. Then the diner's bell chimed again, its brass voice cutting through the tension like a sword through silk. Captain Braxton filled the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing authority like a well-tailored suit rather than a costume. The crowd seemed to part instinctively as he scanned the room, his experienced eyes immediately cataloging the scene. Two of his officers harassing an elderly man, while a room full of citizens watched in uncomfortable silence. "What's going on here?" His voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of command rather than weeks of bullying. Harris froze, his hands still clutching Raymond's jacket. Locke's smug posture deflated like a punctured balloon. "Sir, we were just investigating a suspicious individual," Harris stammered. Braxton's gaze moved to Raymond, who stood with quiet dignity despite the assault on his character. "Suspicious?" The captain's tone suggested he found his officer's behavior far more suspicious than anything Raymond might have done. "He claims to be a veteran, sir," Locke tried, his voice faltering under his captain's stare. "But we're not convinced. He's out of place. Might be a phony." Braxton silenced him with a look sharp enough to cut glass. Then his attention fell to Raymond's table, where the notepad lay beside something else. A small plaque, half hidden and easily overlooked. Intrigued, he reached over and lifted it. The metal felt warm in his hands, polished smooth by years of careful handling. The inscription read, "Raymond Cooper, Staff Sergeant, Purple Heart recipient." Below that, smaller text detailed gallantry in Vietnam, decades past but preserved in brass and memory. The captain's expression transformed as understanding dawned. This wasn't just proof, it was testament to sacrifices these younger officers couldn't begin to comprehend. He turned the plaque reverently, reading the citation that spoke of courage under fire, of blood spilled in service to ideals larger than self. Harris and Locke exchanged panicked glances, suddenly understanding that the thing on his desk, this seemingly simple plaque, represented everything they had failed to recognize. "Sergeant Cooper," Braxton said, his voice thick with respect and regret. "I'm sorry to see you being treated like this." "Captain, we didn't know," Harris began. "But you made no effort to find out, did you?" Braxton's voice hardened like steel cooled in winter air. "Instead, you presumed guilt." He turned to Raymond, his expression softening. "I sincerely apologize on behalf of this department. I recognize your service. We owe you better." Raymond lowered his gaze, relief and lingering anger warring in his chest like competing currents in a turbulent river. "I appreciate that, Captain. I only came here for coffee." The silence that followed felt different. Not the oppressive quiet of injustice, but the expectant hush of consequences gathering like storm clouds. Around the diner, faces that had been carefully neutral now showed quiet satisfaction, as if justice had finally entered the room wearing a captain's uniform. "Officers, step outside, now." Braxton's command brooked no argument. Harris released Raymond and stepped back, swallowing hard. Locke placed his coffee cup on the table with hands that trembled slightly, his face drained of color and confidence. Together, they shuffled toward the exit like schoolboys called to the principal's office, while their captain followed with the measured pace of a man preparing to deliver hard truths. For a moment, the diner held its breath. Then applause began, soft at first, hesitant, then growing as courage found its voice. A middle-aged man at a nearby booth stood, his face creased with regret. "Sorry we didn't step in sooner, sir," he said, voice heavy with shame. "Thank you for your service." Raymond bowed his head in acknowledgement, moved by the gesture despite everything that had preceded it. "Thank you. I understand. Sometimes speaking up is hard." Nora appeared at his elbow with fresh coffee and glistening eyes. "On the house," she whispered. "You deserve more respect than that." Raymond managed a small smile, though his hands still trembled slightly as adrenaline slowly ebbed from his system. "I've faced worse," he said, sipping the coffee that tasted somehow better for being freely given. He stared at the plaque, remembering the weight of memories embedded in its metal surface. He had never boasted about his Purple Heart. Too much pain lay behind that honor, too many faces that would never age beyond their battlefield youth. But in this moment, it had served as more than recognition. It had been a shield protecting his dignity from unwarranted scorn. Outside, muffled voices suggested a heated confrontation between Braxton and his subordinates. The diner patrons exchanged knowing glances, understanding that consequences were being delivered in harsh whispers and professional reprimands. Eventually, Captain Braxton returned alone, his expression grim with the weight of disappointed command. He approached Raymond's table with the careful respect of a man visiting a sacred space. "Mr. Cooper," he said quietly, "I've addressed this incident, and I assure you those two will face disciplinary measures. Again, my sincerest apologies." "I appreciate it, Captain," Raymond replied. "I never wanted a scene. I know, you've always been a humble man." Braxton placed a gentle hand on Raymond's shoulder, not the grip of authority, but the touch of one warrior acknowledging another. "If you need anything, please let us know." With that, he departed, leaving Raymond to his corner and his thoughts. Gradually, the diner's normal rhythms resumed. A few patrons approached to shake his hand, to offer quiet words of gratitude and respect. He accepted their thanks with grace, while preferring not to dwell in the spotlight. He had come for quiet coffee, not vindication. As he prepared to leave, gathering his belongings with the careful precision of a man who had learned to value small rituals, Nora approached one final time. "Please stay and finish your breakfast," she insisted. "We insist, Mr. Cooper." He patted her hand gently, moved by the kindness but ready for solitude. "Thank you, but I have errands to run." He slipped on his jacket, tucking the plaque under his arm, glancing around at faces now filled with empathy, where hostility had lived just minutes before. Outside, the crisp autumn air filled his lungs like a blessing. He inhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as surely as morning mist rising from the river. Once again, his quiet dignity had prevailed against those who would diminish it. One fleeting glimpse of that plaque, sitting there on his desk like a sleeping sentinel, had changed everything. As he walked along Maplewood's main street, past familiar storefronts and beneath trees that had witnessed decades of his quiet presence, Raymond reflected on the morning's events. Those officers had authority, but they lacked the humility that came from understanding their place in the larger story of service. Perhaps they would learn something from this encounter about respect, about the weight of sacrifice, about the danger of snap judgments. Life would continue testing him. He understood that truth in his bones. But after surviving battlefields and heartbreak, after enduring the thousands small cruelties that accumulated like snow in a long winter, he no longer feared such tests. A diner scuffle with arrogant officers was merely another mile marker on a road he had traveled with honor intact. He turned toward home, his mind already returning to peaceful thoughts and the quiet satisfaction that came from standing his ground when standing mattered most. Behind him, Murphy's diner settled back into its comfortable rhythms, but the morning had left its mark on everyone who witnessed it, a reminder that dignity, once earned, cannot be easily stripped away, and that sometimes the most powerful warriors are those who fight their battles in silence until silence is no longer enough.